Few names in sports history carry the same weight as Babe Ruth. Known as the Sultan of Swat or the Colossus of Clout, Ruth wasn't just a baseball player, he was a cultural icon who transformed America's pastime forever. But Babe Ruth had a different side of him that not many people know about. The legend of Babe Ruth is well known by all, but the tragic story of Babe Ruth is one we're going to talk about. George Herman Ruth Jr. was born on February 6, 1895 in Baltimore, Maryland. One of 8 children, only he and his sister Mammy survived infancy. His parents worked long hours, leaving young George to roam the streets, often skipping school and getting into trouble. At the age of 7, his parents sent him to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, a strict institution run by Catholic brothers. It was here that Ruth met Brother Matthias, who introduced him to baseball and became a father figure. Ruth's natural talent quickly stood out. In fact, in 1914, his talent really stuck out, and Ruth made his major league debut as a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He was dominant on the mound, even leading the American League in ERA in 1916. But his bat was too powerful to ignore. By 1919, Ruth had set a new record for 29 home runs, signaling a shift in baseball's future. In 1920, Ruth was sold to the New York Yankees, a move that would change baseball forever. He immediately began smashing home run records, hitting 54 in his first season with the Yankees. Over the next decade, Ruth became the face of the sport, leading the Yankees to 7 World Series titles and cementing their dynasty. Ruth continued to pitch a little bit throughout his career. In 1920, Ruth pitched in just 1 game, in 1921 just 2 with the Yankees. He also pitched 1 game in 1930 and 1 game in 1933. It was pretty clear that Babe Ruth was on his way to being an all-time power hitter and leaving pitching behind. And for the Babe, the rest was history. Throughout his 22-year career, he put up nearly a 163 WAR. He hit 342, 474, 690, with an OPS plus of 206, and of course, he hit 714 home runs. Now, for the most part, that's what most people know about Babe Ruth. He's kind of a guy that was larger than life in the major leagues, and that's really what we know him for. But again, there is a tragic side to Babe Ruth that isn't always talked about, and I think that many people don't know about that we should probably bring up here. Behind Babe Ruth's legendary home runs was a life filled with scandal, heartbreak, and drama. This includes some of the Babe's marriages, some feuds, and his pretty eccentric lifestyle. In 1914, teenage Babe Ruth married Helen Woodford, a Boston waitress. They adopted a daughter, Dorothy, but Ruth's infidelities tore the marriage apart. In fact, Ruth once told one of his managers that he is willing to give up drinking. He is willing to give up drugs, but you cannot ask him to give up women. They're just too fun. Ruth and Woodford's last public appearance was 1926 during the World Series, and just 3 years later, Helen tragically died in a house fire at only 31. The circumstances of that house fire sparked controversy at the time, and to an extent, it remains so today. Looking back on their marriage, when Helen had heard about Ruth's extramarital affairs, she started to feel neglected. She began to have nervous breakdowns, which she was hospitalized for numerous times. Whenever she asked Ruth to let her accompany him to spring training, he would rudely brush her off, and they would often fight. The final straw was when Ruth fell in love with his secretary, Claire Hodgson, whom he met in 1923. However, because they were Catholic, the pair never divorced. Babe and Helen finally separated in 1925. Other than occasionally appearing in a public setting as a couple, the last time being during the 1926 World Series, they lived separate lives for the remainder of their marriage. After the separation, Helen went and met Edward Kinder, a dentist, and she came to work for him as a housekeeper. The pair began a relationship, and she soon moved in with him at his home in Watertown, Massachusetts. But on January 10th, a fire broke out in the living room of the Watertown house. Ruth was alone at her home, and her partner was away at the Boston Garden. She was discovered on the floor of her bedroom by Captain John Kelly of the Watertown Fire Department and was taken to her neighbor's home, where she died of her injuries 12 hours later. Kinder arrived a few hours before she died and was with her. Now, the cause of this fire, according to the Watertown Sun, was defective wiring and overloading of wiring in the living room. Babe Ruth was in New York City when he was informed of his, still at the time, wife's death. Along with Helen's sisters, Nora and Catherine, he went to Boston to confirm that the body was that of his wife. He told reporters immediately afterward, "Boys, I'm in a terrible fix. The shock has been a very great one to me. Please let my wife alone. Let her stay dead. That's all I've got to say. I haven't lived with my wife for 3 years. In that period, I have only seen her a few times. I have done everything to comply with her wishes. Her death is a great shock to me. That's all I have to say." Now, Helen Ruth's family refused to accept that the fire had been accidental, with her brother Thomas asking, "What is there to prove that the house wasn't fired? What is there to prove that she wasn't murdered?" According to her family, Helen lived in fear of her husband, Babe Ruth. Helen's niece, Patricia, said Aunt Helen was in fear for her life because Babe Ruth wanted a divorce because he was carrying on with women. Of course, we were a Catholic family and she would not divorce. He was trying to get rid of her. He had all these hoodlums or what have you. Those are the stories my mother told me. Now, this claim has been contradicted by both official reports and the fact that Ruth made regular payments to Helen and was visibly distraught by her death. Nevertheless, 3 months after Helen's death, Ruth married his longtime mistress, Claire Hodgson. Now, remember that adopted daughter, Dorothy, that we mentioned earlier? Well, in her book, Dorothy claimed that she was Ruth's biological child by a mistress named Juanita Jennings. In 1980, Juanita, who was at the time very ill, admitted this to Dorothy and Dorothy's sister, Julia. So the daughter that Ruth and Helen adopted was actually Babe Ruth's real-life daughter, just with another mistress. Now, Dorothy, Babe Ruth's daughter, and his new adopted daughter, Julia, who was Claire's daughter, were kind of an issue between Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. There was a 7-year rift between the two of them. Sometime in 1932, during a conversation that she assumed was private, Gehrig's mother remarked, "It's a shame Claire doesn't dress Dorothy as nicely as she dresses her own daughter." And when that comment got back to Babe Ruth, he angrily told Gehrig to tell his mother to mind her own business. Gehrig, in turn, took offense at what he perceived as Ruth's comment about his mother. The two reportedly never spoke off the field until they reconciled at Yankee Stadium on Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day, July 4th, 1939, shortly after Lou Gehrig's retirement from baseball. Ruth's infidelities was a big part of who he was. Again, he was asked by the co-owner of the New York Yankees to tone down his lifestyle, and once again, Ruth said, "I'll promise to go easier on drinking and to get to bed earlier, but not for you. $50,000 or $250,000 would I give up women. They're too much fun." The Yankees hired a detective to follow him one night in Chicago, and they reported that Ruth had been with 6 women. Prior to the 1922 season, Ruth signed a 3-year contract at $52,000 a year, with an option to renew for 2 additional years. His performance during the 1922 season had been disappointing, attributed in part to his drinking and late night hours. In fact, at the end of the 1922 season, he was asked to sign a contract addendum with a morals clause. It called for Ruth to abstain entirely from the use of intoxicating liquids and to not stay up later than 1 a.m. during the training and playing season without permission of the manager. Ruth was also enjoined from any action or misbehavior that would compromise his ability to play baseball. Doctors had cautioned Ruth to take better care of his health, and he grudgingly followed their advice, limiting his drinking and not going on a proposed trip to support the troops in the South Pacific. In 1946, Ruth began experiencing severe pain over his left eye and had difficulty swallowing. In November 1946, Ruth entered the French hospital in New York for tests, which revealed he had an inoperable malignant tumor on the base of his skull and in his neck. A physician who reviewed Ruth's autopsy in 1998 concluded that Ruth's lifelong use of tobacco probably played a part in his cancer. His name and fame gave him access to experimental treatments, and he was one of the first cancer patients to receive both drugs and radiation treatment simultaneously. Interestingly enough, the doctors had not told Ruth that he had cancer because of his family's fear that he might harm himself. The Yankees had proclaimed April 27, 1947 as Babe Ruth Day around the major leagues. A number of teammates and others spoke in honor of Ruth, who briefly addressed the crowd of almost 60,000. By then, his voice was a soft whisper with a very low, raspy tone. Now, with some of the chemotherapy and the drugs that Ruth was going through, he was able to have some dramatic improvement during the summer of 1947, so much so that he was able to travel the country doing promotional work for the Ford Motor Company on American Legion Baseball. He appeared again at another day in his honor at Yankee Stadium in September, but he was not well enough to pitch in an old-timers game. At this point, from all of the treatments, all of the years of alcohol abuse and tobacco abuse, Babe Ruth's body was quoted as gaunt and hollowed out. That was on June 5th of 1948 when Ruth visited Yale University to donate a manuscript of the Babe Ruth story to its library. On June 13th, Ruth visited Yankee Stadium for the final time in his life, appearing at the 25th anniversary celebrations of the house that Ruth built. By this time, he had lost so much weight and had difficulty walking. Introduced along with his surviving teammates from 1923, Ruth used a bat as a cane. Ruth's condition gradually grew worse, and only a few visitors were permitted to see him when he was in Memorial Hospital, which is where he would later die. Commissioner Ford C. Frick said, "Ruth was so thin it was unbelievable. He had been such a big man, and his arms were just skinny little bones, and his face was so haggard." On August 16th, 1948, at 8:01 p.m., Babe Ruth died in his sleep at the age of 53. Babe Ruth was so much more than just a ball player. He was a hero, a showman, and a reminder that sometimes legends are born swinging for the fences. But he was also human, and those fallacies ultimately led to a tarnished legacy for the Sultan of Swat. But again, the legacy of Babe Ruth is one of triumph in the early days of baseball, setting home run records and being one of the biggest names to ever play this game. And in the end, that's the legacy that he leaves behind. You know what they say, heroes get remembered, but legends never die.